Shabbat Shalom. So nice to see so many people. We're delighted to have everybody, including one of our previous scholars in residence. Jenny, I don't know if you're here. Yes, okay. So David, as many of you know, David Lepofsky is a Canadian lawyer and disability rights advocate who's dedicated his career to fighting for the rights of people with disabilities. He's known for his work in promoting accessibility and inclusion, particularly in the areas of transportation, education, and employment. Lepofsky's been involved in numerous landmark cases and has played a key role in shaping legislation and policies that protect the rights of individuals with disabilities. He's a passionate advocate for equal opportunities and has been recognized for his tireless efforts in advancing disability rights in Canada. So thank you, David, and we look forward to your teaching.
Got it. Well, doesn't this feel like a blind date? By the way, that's how Jill and I met. So we're veterans. Thank you so much for the honor of playing this role in your congregation. Thank you for welcoming me and Jill to your congregation. And unexpected, when you issued the invitation, Tali, take a stand up. I want people to see who you are. I want you to meet my friend Tali Sarnetsky, who's here for a month staying with us just to avoid the crisis that's going on in Israel. More about that in a couple of minutes. Thanks for welcoming us all. We live in a world that is overwhelmingly designed and operated on a fundamental, pervasive, and ridiculous basis. It is designed and operated overwhelmingly on the assumption that the only people out there who want to fully participate in it and should are people without disabilities. The public transit we ride, the stores where we shop and the goods that we buy there, the school system that trains our kids, and the colleges and universities the same, the workplaces and the job descriptions there, even the laws that we operate under and the courts that administrate them, they're all designed and operated on that overwhelming premise. Now, it's not that there's a conspiracy out there against us. The usual answer is, oh, we just never thought of you folks. But you know what? If there had been a conspiracy, no, I'm not a conspiracy theorist. If there had been a conspiracy, the world would not look any different than it does for us. Well, let me get nosy. Let's see how many of you this affects. I'm going to do a survey. It's completely unscientific, and therefore, as a lawyer, I love it. I would like you to raise your hand if you have no disability now and you are certain you will not get one for the rest of your life. Please raise your hand. I don't see any hands. I actually never do. We are the weirdest minority of everyone, we people with disabilities, because everybody either has a disability now or has someone near and dear to them with a disability, or gets one later, because aging is the biggest cause of disability. So we live in a world that absurdly is designed full of barriers that ultimately hurt us all. So what do we do about it? Well, in Canada, we have a series of laws that didn't come from our legislators. They came bottom up from us people with disabilities, fighting for them. And I've been very actively involved as a volunteer in trying to get some of those laws passed, working with other people with disabilities, and now trying to get them effectively implemented. Mostly our governments are doing a lousy job, though we are making some progress. I was going to talk all about that today, but I am not, because of the issues regarding Israel that I think we need to focus on now. Though my next talk here, because you've foolishly inflicted me on yourselves twice this year, at least. I'm going to come back and talk about Canada more later. But if you want to learn more in the meantime, I'm going to ask the shul to send out on in your bulletin a link to sign up for email updates from the coalition I lead, so you can learn more about what's involved and how you can get involved. And I'd be happy to talk to your social action committee how, as a collectivity, you can. But this pervasive premise isn't just in Canada. It's all around the world, including Israel. And I would like to talk to you about what's going on and what we can do about it. Now, before October 7th, there was lots to say. I'm going to compress that into 3 minutes and spend the rest of my time talking about this since October 7th. And I'm going to conclude with a what you can do. Because heck, when you're a social justice advocate, you can't leave an audience without what you could do. So people think that Israel must be great on disability issues because they've got so many victims of war and so many war wounded and so many victims of terrorists. Kind of like some people thought that, hey, they had Golda Meir as prime minister, they must be great on equal rights for women. Doesn't work that way. It's a very common belief, but it's really not so. While the population of Israel, Jewish, Palestinian citizens of Israel, everybody else, same proportion of people with disabilities as here and elsewhere. We're talking upwards of 20% of the public. Ontario, 2.9 million. Across Canada, 6 million. Around the world, upwards of 1 billion. We're kind of everywhere. But I've been on 2 study tours led by the RENA Foundation, one this past June, looking at disability issues in Israel and services. And I'm going to simplify the world for you into 2 Israels. One response to disability has been the innovative, world-leading, startup nation, come up with amazing new stuff, Israel. So you'll see new technology. You will see creative new rehabilitation services. You'll see clever new accessibility legislation, frankly, better written and better enforced than Ontario's. But of course that makes sense because, Ontario has to worry about so many more things than Israel, right? But beyond that, areas where you turn to them and say, man, that's impressive, and properly so. On the other hand, there's the other Israel. The Israel that reflects an approach to disability driven by pity, by charity, not rights, by, oh, you're so inspiring, and which we call inspiration porn in the disability rights biz, by the way, and so on. And there are examples of that. Let's build beautiful buildings for them and segregate them in programs there, and then we could feel like we're doing so much wonderfully for them, and maybe even have, birthright tours stop to see them so people can be so impressed, even though it's a kind of a decades-old, out-of-date attitude towards disability. Now, obviously, the world is somewhere in between. There are illustrations of each in Israel. And as well in Israel, before October 7th, there were crushing examples of missed opportunities. Let me give you one. A recurring problem around the world, we've got it right here, is a crisis shortage of accessible housing. Well, in the late 80s through the 90s, Israel welcomed upwards of 1 million Russian immigrants, built entire communities, tons of new housing. If they had decided that they would require at least some of them to be accessible, they could have been the country with the biggest proportion of accessible housing in the world, but sadly they didn't. Rather, they built a ton of new, lovely housing full of new accessibility barriers. Now let's move forward And by the way, Israel has a vibrant disability rights community, more about that in a minute, and disability services community trying to work creatively in all of these spaces. Then comes October 7th, and a crisis and emergency that no one was ready for. Now, we've been there, we people with disabilities. We, with everyone, just came through COVID, where we had a crisis emergency that no one was ready for, and a government that here took a one-size-fits-all response that assumed that, like, nobody has a disability, and was entirely or predominantly inattentive to the emergency needs or urgent emergency needs of people with disabilities. I and my coalition, working with others in the disability community, spent months battling against that during COVID. Now imagine, let me give you a hypothetical that illustrates the point. You work in a high-rise building here in an office, and they've got an emergency plan in case of a fire. And the emergency plan is invoked because a fire happens. So what is there? There's an audible alarm that sounds, and then there's lighting on the floor to guide you to the stairs, and then you go down the stairs. The alarm goes off, and suddenly they realize, heck, we have some employees who are deaf, and we don't have any visual alarms. How are they going to know there's even an alarm? And then the lighting goes up on the walkway or on the floor to guide you. Oh my God, we got some employees who are blind, they can't see that. And then you get to the top of the stairs, and some of the people there are in wheelchairs. Flight of stairs, that's really useful. Do we have a safe area of refuge for them to be in, which will be safe even in a fire? Oh, we didn't think of that. One-size-fits-all emergency planning that assumes everybody has a disability, even though we're the minority of everybody, it's pervasive. And it hurts. So what's happened in Israel? The impact of the crisis on everyone is, of course, horrific. I don't need to tell you that. And, of course, the impact on the innocent civilians of Gaza is horrific, and especially on those in Gaza who have had disabilities before or have acquired them since. They are the victims of twin Hamas crimes, the crime of the launching of starting a war with Israel, and the consequent crime, the strategy of using civilians, including people with disabilities, to hide behind as a war strategy. And I'm going to talk about what's going on inside Israel, but I don't for a moment discount the horrors they're facing. So within Israel, let's begin with the fact, let me just list some of the impacts that I've heard about. First, we know that there's upwards of 250,000 Israelis, Jews, Arabs, others, who've had to be relocated within the country on an emergency basis. On a webinar on this subject that's up on YouTube, the estimate from the Joint Distribution Committee that I heard was that at least 50,000 displaced people are people with disabilities. Then there, of course, among the hostages, there are people with disabilities, including kids with disabilities. Then there are the many people with disabilities, young and old, who are dependent on others as their caregivers. But their caregivers may have been murdered, or may have been injured, or may be displaced as well, without the capacity to deliver the same care. Or their caregivers may have been called up to the army, since 360,000 people were called up to the army on a country of 9 million, like, do the math. And with all of this, superimpose on that apart from all the other disabilities that have been caused, there's been a huge mental health crisis imposed on everyone there, and frankly here, between what's going on there and the rise of anti-Semitism, we are all the victims of a collective PTSD. And caregiving in a crisis under that kind of mental trauma just makes it harder. Let's then add to it the consequences of the crisis itself. If you have to be able to get to a safe shelter within 90 seconds, 60 seconds, 30 seconds, 10 seconds, what if that shelter isn't accessible? Even though by law they're supposed to be, doesn't mean they all are. You've got to know where those shelters are and talk to Tully about what it's like to try to find them. If you decide to go somewhere, you just got to go out shopping. And if you're visually impaired, how do you know where they are? I was with Esther and Yehuda and others on a New Israel Fund tour in Israel in May. There was a 5-day altercation, conflict with Gaza. We had to go to the shelter once. Fortunately, we were in the lobby of a hotel. The alarm went off. I was with a bunch of my compatriots on the New Israel Fund tour. We just, walked into the shelter. It was easy there. But you have to know every minute of every day where they are and make sure you're near them. And I got to tell you, when I go somewhere new, if I'm alone, I got to learn my way around. I do it all the time. But now added to that is, by the way, where the heck is the shelter? That is a layer of stress that you can't quantify. On a webinar 2 days ago, hearing from an organization that deals with running group homes, a number of their staff have either been called up or have been murdered and are not available. So group homes for people with sometimes complex disabilities are now having to be staffed in part by volunteers who are untrained. This is a huge, complicated mess. Now, add to all of this, what happens if you're a Palestinian citizen of Israel? I have a dear friend who works in Nazareth, lives in Ramat Yishai, named Abbas Abbas. You got to see the two of us together. I swear, you can't write this stuff. He's a Palestinian citizen of Israel who's a lawyer, who's visually impaired, and who advocates on disability rights. He's my doppelganger. And Abbas and I have become very good friends, and I called him. And of course, incoming missiles aren't labeled and targeted only at targets of any one particular religion or community. Everybody's at risk. And the worry about the potential for incoming missiles from Lebanon, same thing. But Abbas will tell you, before he founded an organization called Al-Manara, which is an independent living center for Palestinian citizens of Israel with disabilities. And he'll tell you they face double barriers. The barriers you face as a person with a disability and the challenges faced by Palestinian citizens of Israel. Now, add to that all the barriers I just talked about, and they've got even more on their hands, as if all of this wasn't enough. So what do you do about it? Well, 53 years ago, when I got up to do my bar mitzvah, I read a line that I did not realize at the time as a 13-year-old would later, we would arrange, be in the Torah portion that our daughter Raya would read years later, last year, for her bat mitzvah. From the book of chapter 19 of Vayikra, Leviticus, Lo tikalel cheresh v'lifnei iver lo titen michshol. Do not curse a deaf person, and do not put an obstacle or barrier in front of a blind person. Folks, the guarantee of equality for people with disabilities, guess where it started? The duty to accommodate, the duty not to create barriers against people with disabilities. It's in the Torah. We fought for it as a modern law here. We did not invent anything new. And so when you take those principles and apply them to this, what is being done about this in Israel now? Well, as I'm sure you've heard, the government response for the civil front of the war, that is to say, organizing people to be able to relocate in the country and so on, the government's job did a fairly miserable job, and civil society, private organizations have had to step up to the plate. And they've done an amazing job. But doing that in a crisis, you still run the risks of people with disabilities being left out, or emergency measures being closer to the fire alarm I told you about. So I want to tell you about, there are a number of organizations that are stepping up to the plate to try to fix this. They're doing amazing work. I'm just going to wrap up by telling you about two, and to invite you to consider contributing to them to help out this cause during this crisis. The first organization, and it's one I know extremely well, is called Bizchut. Bizchut is the Disability Rights Legal Center in Jerusalem for Israel. They serve people with disabilities of all religions, races, denominations. They advocate for new legislation. They fight cases in court. Before this ever happened, their 30-year track record was already incredibly impressive. Two examples: in the late 90s and the early 2000s, they led a cross-disability coalition that got Israel's strong accessibility legislation enacted. And that was an impressive job. The first commissioner of disability rights who was hired to lead its implementation had just been the executive director of Bizchut. Bizchut means by right. It's from the tradition, a line in our tradition, Bizchut v'lo b'chesed, by right and not by charity. The second thing they did is much more recent. Just a year and a half ago, the Israeli parliament was, for the 8 millionth time, collapsing. And it was already determined that they were going to have yet another election. But in the last 5 days, Bizchut led an effort to get a groundbreaking new piece of legislation for disability services and social services passed. This is after it was clear the government was going to fall. They still managed to broker new legislation in that Knesset. Go figure. They are doing amazing work now. They are involved now in potentially litigation and in advocacy and in training people to do their own self-advocacy to address any number of the kinds of barriers during this crisis that I just described. And I've emailed to the shul a 2-page summary of what they're doing during the crisis, all invented in the past 5 weeks, all under incredible stress. If you want to donate to them, I encourage you to. The way to do it and get a charitable receipt is to donate to the New Israel Fund of Canada and to donor advise it to Bizchut, B-I-Z-C-H-U-T. Your shul has kindly offered to pay me for my role with you this year. I don't take money for this. And I've already, before this began, asked the money that was going to go to me, go to them. I ask you to consider helping them out through this crisis now. The second organization I want to tell you about is this amazing, amazing children's rehab center in Ra'anana. In fact, at lunch you could ask Tali about it because she's had a connection there too. It's right near where she lives. It's called Bet Izzy Shapiro. And if is Joanna here? Hey, the executive director of Canadian Friends of Bet Izzy Shapiro is here, Joanna Samuels. We are about to meet for the first time in person. We just met on the phone. I've been to Bet Izzy, I don't remember how many times. They are amazing. They have invented incredible, like when I talked about the Startup Nation, the amazing Israeli response to disability, they've invented incredible, innovative rehab therapies for kids with complex disabilities. They serve the Jewish and Arab populations. They provide free training around the world to developing countries. I was at the United Nations. They invited me when they got to do a presentation at a conference at the United Nations. I went to the United Nations with a group from Israel, not expecting a warm welcome. And I'm walking around with these folks from Bet Izzy. Everybody loves them. They're amazing, the response they get. They are so impressed with them. Anyway, Bet Izzy, who you can donate through, you can talk to Joanna, the Canadian friends of Bet Izzy Shapiro. Bet Izzy has repurposed during this crisis all of their resources, from day-to-day therapy to supporting families of kids with complex disabilities in this crisis, whether they're whether families who've had to move from the front lines, wherever they may be. That is one of their core supports. And at lunch, you can talk to Joanna about other great things they're doing, but they are really impressive. And the thing that's distinctive that I want to share with you about if you choose to support Bet Izzy, or if you choose to support Bizchut, or both, is that they are both below the radar of the main Jewish funding avenues, charitable funding avenues that you have in the community. So if you want to help out organizations that are doing critical work, that are trying to offset that kind of fire in the high-rise scenario I gave you, and you want to help out folks who are not on the usual radar of the main funders, those are two fabulous examples. Let me conclude by telling you it is a tremendous, tremendous honor to be able to get to know you. I look forward to doing whatever I can with your shul, here, formally, informally, and with the kids in your religious school. I thank you for honoring me with this role. I thank you for including this topic as a priority for your shul. And let us today live up to the requirement, to the commandment, Lo tikal el cheresh, v'lifnei iver, lo titen michshol. Shabbat shalom.